Another Jeepin' with Cool Guy video. What else have you got to do with your time? Welcome back to another episode of Jeepin' with Cool Guy. Two things to cover today. One, finally pulled the previous restored 84 CJ7 out of storage. It's been sitting in its winter slumber for the past few months. Now that the weather's starting to warm up, wanted to get it back out. So excited to get this thing back out on the road again. I am so thrilled with this thing now that we've got it all put together. I'll put a video out there in the next few weeks on kind of a walk around and show you how it looks post-restoration. But anyways, just wanted to show you this. But what I really wanted to talk about today was the routing of your brake and fuel lines on your frame-off restoration. I used the original ones that I had. They were rusted through and dilapidated. Ran a completely brand new set. So I'm going to show you where these things are, how they attach, and kind of how I did it on my own. And to be honest with you, it's really not that hard to do. It's probably a 3-hour job, maybe 4-hour job at best. But I used as many of the original line clamps as I could, powder coated all those, and I replaced all the fasteners with stainless steel fasteners. So I'm going to show you the locations. I'll also put a link in the description of where I bought these particular lines. But with all that said, I installed nickel cop or copper nickel cop lines, both for the brake and for the fuel. One thing you do not want to ever do is to install copper lines. Copper lines just don't work. They can't handle up to the pressure. You could probably run it for the fuel lines, although I wouldn't recommend doing any of that. Go with the nickel cop. You can do the stainless steel, but stainless steel is really hard to bend. So if you're going to go that route, make sure that you get the prefab, the pre-bent setup. But you can do this for really cheap on your own. So let's start with the fuel line routing. So we're going to start with the gas tank. Now this is a 79, and the only modification that I made to this one that wasn't original equipment is this 20-gallon poly tank. I found one of these locally. The skid plate was in really good shape. The tank was in exceptional shape. And I'm like, all right, so I can put a 20-gallon gas tank on this thing, and it's still original equipment, just not accurate to the year. So this was a really nice find. Anyways, in a previous video, I showed you how to replace the gaskets, the valve vent gaskets on this tank. So if you need to do that, pay attention to it. But the way that this thing works is, starting with the sending unit, there are two lines that run out of the sending unit. The smaller line, which I believe is a 1/4-inch return line, this comes out of the smaller port of the sending unit, wraps around and goes to this line, which is also a nickel copper line that runs up to the fuel return out of your fuel filter right in front of the carburetor. Second line is your main fuel line. This is a 5/16 inch line. This comes out, wraps around, and goes to a 5/16 inch nickel copper line that is all held in place with this bracket. Goes on top of the curve of this cross member, curves around here, and then goes over to your actual fuel pump and your fuel filter. The vapor lines that connect these two, there's one line that connects both of the vapor units, and that tees out of there and then runs over to a line that connects to the check valve and the rollover valve that is behind the driver's side rear wheel baffle. This other line is the vapor return line from your charcoal canister up by the engine. Now I'm going to walk you through and kind of do a live action motion. So there you can see we have our 3 fuel lines, the main fuel line, the fuel return line, and the vapor line. And then we're just going to follow this along. And the main fuel line goes along the rear cross member that the fuel tank connects to. There's a couple brackets that hold it into place, and then it goes along the wall, takes a 90-degree bend, comes right behind the shock absorber. This is all on the passenger side. There's another vibration bracket right there, and then it curves out and around at about a 45-degree angle, that shock absorber. Along here, if you have the original lines, you will probably have a rock guard. This is a stainless steel rock guard that I got through this company called the Brakes, or the Stop Shop, I believe. I'll put that link in the description. Comes around. For the 76 through 79, I believe, there is this rear cross member that runs right in front of the shock absorber. There is another mounting spot for a vibration bracket, or just basically a holding bracket for the fuel line. Then it curves back towards the frame, then it levels off, and then it runs right along about an inch below the frame line. Switch up the angle here a little bit, and then this fuel line runs right up the passenger side, mounts on the engine mount right here with this bracket, and then takes a 90-degree turn. There is a small hose held in by a couple clamps, and I've put an inline fuel filter just so that I get everything filtered out before it actually gets into the fuel pump itself. And then there's another connecting line. These are all 5/16 inch inner diameter hoses, fuel hoses. This line, this main fuel line, is a 5/16 inch nickel cop line. And then coming out of the actual fuel pump, there is a 5/16 inch line that goes up, and you can route this however you want. I've got mine just going right over the top, in between the PCV valve and the oil cap, and then it comes down along, connects to another hose piece, and then that's going to connect to your actual fuel filter. One thing to note, when you actually install this fuel filter, and this is the one that goes into the carburetor, there's two ports that come out of this. The main one, which is this bottom one here, that's the one that runs through the carburetor. This top one is an overflow or a excess fuel return line that runs back to the return line at your fuel tank. When you install this, you want to make sure that this top smaller port is up as opposed to down, because basically otherwise, if it was like this, then the fuel is going to go primarily to your return line, and you won't get as much of a draw through to your carburetor. Now we're going to switch over to the other side. This is the driver's side. This is where your carburetor would be, and that fuel return line port on your fuel filter is going to be connected to a 3/8 inch hose that's going to run down to this line right here. I haven't bent this up right yet, but this will be pointing up, and then that line will be connected to your fuel filter. So this line, and as you can see, I've got the rock guard on it that runs pretty much the length of it. It goes past and is mounted to your proportioning valve by a small clamp. Then that goes along here and then runs back to where your emergency brake connects, bends out and around that to give it a little bit of space, and then runs along here, bends back towards the frame, then lines up with the frame again, another mounting bracket, goes along here to another mounting bracket on your muffler and emergency brake support frame bracket. Peels away from the frame, bends out. Again, you can see the rock guard that is installed on here. There's a good angle of the bends within the tubes. On the 79, again, we have this rear cross member right in front of the shock absorber. There's another clamp that holds that in place. It bends back towards the frame, lines up with the frame. Another support clamp. Goes along, takes a 90-degree turn right in this back corner, and then goes on to the fuel tank and then connects to the fuel return line right here. Moving back up towards the front of the Jeep. Basically about here is where your cowl's going to be. This is your front mount support right across from your bell housing, right in front of your proportioning valve. There's this vapor return line. Now the reason that I stopped it here is because your canister, vapor canister, is going to be about here. And I'm just going to run a rubber hose. This is a 1/4 inch tube. That'll be a 1/4 inch internal diameter hose that will run up to your charcoal canister right here into that appropriate port. This line runs completely in tandem with the fuel return line coming from your fuel filter. So it goes out, comes to the point of where the emergency brake cable connects to the frame, bends out and around, bends back towards the frame, runs along with the frame. There again we have our holding clamp, goes along, holding clamp right above the muffler, and bends out and around. Holding clamp. Now you'll see that I actually installed the rock guard on the vapor return line. Probably a little overkill, but I had a little bit of excess, so I decided to use it. And to be honest with you, I want to make sure that the whatever minimal vacuum that you have running inside of your return line is not compromised by a cut or a hole in the line over the course of time. Then it moves back and around, curves back towards the frame right behind the shock absorber, goes along, takes another 90-degree bend right in this back area, then is held in place by this clamp right on this top rear cross member that holds the tank in place, and then connects to this other vapor return line that runs to this hose, and this again is a 1/4 inch internal diameter hose. This will be the other connecting line that is going to be part of the check rollover valve behind the driver's side wheel well baffle. That will come in another episode when I actually get all that hooked together. So now, let's move on to the brake lines. So before we go any further on the brake line routing, I do want to preface this that this is for a 79 CJ7, which means that it's going to be the narrow track. So the caliper is going to be different than from the 82 to 86 when they went to the wide track and used a different caliper. You can see how that mounting bolt, banjo bolt or whatever it's called for the caliper, is really tight within that wheel knuckle. So there's your brake line, flexible brake line that runs up and around and then connects to this frame mounting bracket. Then you have your brake line that connects by way of your fitting. This goes through the frame, comes out on the inside of the frame, and then takes almost like a 180 turn and wraps around the front cross member of the frame and right above your sway bar support bracket. You're probably going to want to make sure that this line is set down fairly low because your radiator is going to be running right above it. This is a 3/16 inch line that I have run pretty much for the entire brake system, and I've got the rock guard on 99% of it. There is a specific clamp or bracket that holds it into the front crossmember on the frame that I haven't been able to find any replications for, so I used what was on there originally, and the line is just pushed down into this holding bracket, and there's one on both sides. So there's one here and there's one on this side. So as we move around, this brake line curves down and around, falls in behind your power steering lines. You want to make sure that this is as close to the frame as you possibly can to be out of the way of everything. And then it goes along right above your sway bar mount bracket and below the power steering lines. And right here is where your other brake line comes through. So now we move on to the driver's side brake line coming up out of the caliper. And that line feeds along over to the frame mount support bracket. Then it is connected to your brake line by your fitting. That goes through the frame, comes through the frame and does exactly what the passenger side does. Comes out, basically takes a 180-degree turn, and then goes back along the frame, right underneath the engine. So now I'm underneath the vehicle, and as it runs back from the front, it curves out and around the engine mount, as you can see by these two curved lines here, enough to give yourself pretty good clearance, then bends back towards the frame, and then at this point it starts to split out and connects to our proportioning valve. So one line connects to this top port of the proportioning valve, and the other line connects to the bottom part of the proportioning valve. Both of these are, again, 3/16 inch connectors and lines, but it really doesn't matter whether this is the left or the right or this is the left or the right, because these brakes are not that sophisticated. They're not anti-lock brakes, there's no sensor on them, so whether you do this as the left or the right or this is the left or the right really makes no difference. So then up here on your proportioning valve are the two lines that will run to your master cylinder, and then there is the one rear line runs to the back brakes. Here's a top view of your proportioning valve with the lines coming out of it. The metal bracket right there is a mounting bracket for the two lines that will run up to your master cylinder. And those two holes that you see in that bracket are there for clamps to hold the master cylinder connecting hoses in place. Here's our rear brake line, and it's just the one line that services both of the rear drums. That comes out, and it runs the exact same path as our fuel lines. So it's held in place by the bracket, goes along, curves out around the emergency brake frame connector, then curves back in, goes along, mounted in place by that clamp, goes over the top and is held in place by the clamp above the muffler mount support, goes along, bends away from the frame, goes over the top of the cross member, around the shock absorber, back towards the frame, held in place by the clamp, then comes along, takes a 90-degree turn, and goes along the lines of the rear cross member, and it's completely up to you whether you want to put it in front of, above, or below the fuel line, the main fuel line. Then comes along, held in place by another clamp on this rear cross member, then connects to this mounting bracket, and then goes right into the hose that connects down to this T on your AMC 20 axle. In regards to this clamp for the rear brakes, the more astute or knowledgeable CJ7 owners will notice that this didn't exist on the 76 through 81 Jeeps. This was actually here. This rear brake line is actually mounted to this rear cross member, not this rear cross member. So when they took this away in 79 or 81 or whenever they actually took it away, then they moved the mounting bracket to this rear cross member. I liked the way that this was oriented because I didn't like the line kind of hanging down in front of the axle. I like it being behind the axle when I'm doing all my off-roading. So I actually rebuilt this and just welded this into place. So yeah, it's obviously a little bit of a modification, but that was just preference. It really doesn't affect the value of the original restoration, concourse restoration that I'm attempting to do. This T-bracket, which is actually part of this hose, mounts to the AMC with a hole that's drilled into the actual axle pipe and then held in place by a 1.25 inch long bolt. And then you have one line that runs along the back part of the axle, or is held in place by a connecting clamp that's part of the axle perch of the rear axle. And then that goes along, kind of bends back up in, and then connects to the wheel cylinder on both sides. I did a lot of forming to make this look as good and as to get it behind the axle as much as I can, so it is protected by the axle and the suspension. And I actually did that for both sides. So the driver's side comes out, curves behind the axle, and then runs the line of the differential cover, and then you can choose any one of these bolts, but you should connect a support clamp on one of these bolts so it holds it in place. But you can see this thing isn't going anywhere. It doesn't move at all. And then it goes down along, hides behind the axle, bends along the lines, gets connected to the axle perch by a holding clamp, then bends back up and around and goes into the wheel cylinder. So you can see the way that I formed these, that I did a lot of hand bending, but I wanted to make sure that it was protected by the axle at all costs and in every possible touch point. So there's two tools that I had to do this, and the one that I prefer the most is this one. I got this from Harbor Freight. It's just a simple hose bending tool, and it's got different sizes in it. 3/16, 1/4 inch, maybe 5/16. But this does a really nice job of giving you a nice, easy bend. The one thing I will say when you start doing these lines is practice a little bit. Don't just go willy-nilly and say, I'm going to start bending my own lines and putting it in there. Because there's actually an art form, and you have to learn how the lines themselves actually bend. The reason I'm bringing that up is the smaller lines, like the 3/16 inch or the 1/4 inch lines, you don't want to do by hand because they have a habit of like bending and kind of crimping really easily, and this tool does a really nice job of stretching the nickel cop easily. Where the larger one, like the fuel line, the main fuel line, which is a 5/16 inch line, I would not recommend using this thing on it because I could not bend it at all without the thing crimping up on itself. So I did that all just by hand bending. And this stuff is so easily pliable, it's not hard to bend. So that's why I recommend the nickel cop. The other tool that you could get is this bending tool, which looks like a pair of pliers, and it has a curved end to it. So you clamp this down over the top of the hose and you just kind of bend it by hand. The problem that I found with this is that even if you were using the correct size, and there's only two sizes to this particular pliers, is that it actually wound up crimping the hose line a little bit, and I didn't want to do that. So I recommend this tool. Get one of these, they're really super cheap, and then practice a little bit on some of your brake lines, and I think that you'll find that once you figure it out, this is a really nice, easy tool to use and to work with, and then you'll be able to bend your fuel line or your brake lines very much like I did with the ones in the rear, or the ones that come out of the frame, go through the frame in the front part of your brake lines. When you're trying to bend a whole 180, you can do that by hand, but you're not going to get a really smooth bend. Fuel filter to connecting hose, 5/16 inch line going around the valve cover, either over it or around the front, down to your fuel pump connector, hose line coming out of your fuel pump down into an inline fuel filter if you choose to install one. Coming out of that, there is another hose line connector, and then we get into the 5/16 inch nickel cop that is mounted to the engine bracket, goes along the line of the frame, clamp holding it in place, still on the frame, another clamp holding it in place, goes along the back towards the rear cross member, comes out from the frame, goes across the cross member, mounted in place by that bracket. There is the rock guard installed from the point where it peels off away from the frame, goes back towards the frame, around the shock absorber, into and connected by that bracket on the frame. That's where the rock guard ends. Takes a 90-degree turn, goes along the line of the rear cross member, mounted in place by that bracket, bends up and around and over the top of the fuel tank cross member, get connected to the hose, 5/16 internal diameter hose, goes along underneath the tank strap, then connects into your fuel sender. Fuel return line comes out, goes underneath the tank strap, goes up and along, connects to the 1/4 inch nickel cop line, goes over the top of the cross member, takes a 90-degree turn, goes into the corner of the frame in front of the cross member, then bends along the line of the frame, held in place by a clamp. Rock guard is installed, bends out away from the frame, around the shock absorber, mounted onto the cross member, bends back towards the frame, goes along the line of the frame. Rock guard stops at this point, mounted to the muffler and emergency brake support by the clamp, goes along the lines of the frame, bends out around the emergency brake, goes back towards the frame, goes along right above and is connected to your proportioning valve, then goes up and along the frame, and then that will be eventually connected to the return line from the fuel filter. Fuel vapor line starts, at least as far as the line goes, about just short of the front body mount on the frame, driver's side. Goes along the line, runs the exact same path as the brake line and the fuel line. Bends out around the emergency brake bracket, connected by the bracket. Muffler support bracket, over the top of the cross member, around the shock absorber. I still have the rock guard on it, just in this spot where it peels away from the frame and then back to the frame. Takes a 90-degree angle at the back corner of the frame, bends up and around the top of the cross member, connected by the bracket above the cross member, then connects to this vapor line, which will eventually connect to the check valve and the rollover valve, and then that connects to this other vapor return line, that goes into and connects to the two check valves on the top of your gas tank. If you have the 15-gallon gas tank, there will be two metal ports on the driver's side of the gas tank near the rear of it. Those are where these two lines would connect to these two lines. So that's where your check valve and your rollover valve would connect to from your vapor return line. Passenger side brake line coming out of the caliper, going along through the frame, takes almost a 180-degree turn, comes along, runs below the frame line, right along the curvature of the front crossmember, underneath the power steering lines, goes along the frame, back towards, underneath and around the driver's side engine mount, curves back up and around, close to the frame, connects to your proportioning valve. Then you have your rear brake line, comes out of the back of the proportioning valve, runs the same line as the fuel lines, around the emergency bracket, connection bracket, muffler bracket, around and over the top of the crossmember, around the shock absorber, back and along the frame, takes a 90-degree angle, turn, comes along, mounted to the crossmember, curves into and is connected to the rear crossmember hose line support clamp, connected to the brake line, goes down, connects to the axle, comes out and around, bends around the AMC 20, mounted to the axle perch, and then into the wheel cylinder. Other side of that goes along the AMC 20, back around the differential cover, supported by the one clamp on one of the differential cover bolts. Goes down along, stays behind the line of the AMC 20, connected to the axle perch, then up to the wheel cylinder. Well, that may have been a lot of alternating angles, but I hope you get the gist of how you can route your fuel lines and your brake lines and how to do it. Hope that was educational. Kind of felt that it was. This is the second time around for me to have run the lines. There's slight differences obviously between the 86 to 82 and then from the 81s to the 76s. I don't know if the 76 and the 77 are any different. I know that there are some interesting differences between the 76 and the 77s with the rest of them, but I'm assuming that the brake line routing and the fuel line routing is identical. So hopefully that is the case. If you have any questions in regards to these lines or anything in the CJ7 world, put them in the comments. I'll try and answer them with whatever limited knowledge that I have, and hopefully we can get you back up and running. And as always, like and subscribe. Helps me out, helps the CJ7 community out, it helps everybody out.